This is a fascinating machine. What is it?
This is the Atavachron. I'm sure you'll find something here that pleases you.
This appears to be an archive or library of some kind.
You are listening to the Tricorder transmissions.
You may select from more than 20,000 various pages.
And now, here are Jeff and Claire.
The library serves no purpose unless someone is using it.
We have to fix all of this somehow. It's just like Chicago, except with more guns. Now we're on the run. You wanted to split up, and so I hijacked the radio while you were in the bag.
And that was a bit from 5-Year Mission's A Piece of the Action, which you can find on their Year 3 album. If you like what you heard, take a spin over to 5yearmission.net or iTunes and pick up some of the band's music. You definitely will not be disappointed. So, well, welcome to the Tricorder Transmissions. This is our brand new series, Atavachron. It's going to be running alongside our 4 other series, one of which has been wrapped up right now, but there's 3 others that are continually running. And this is going to be a little bit different than our typical commentary episodes. And of course, if my voice sounds familiar, that's because I am Jeff Hewlett, one half of the usual Tricorder Transmissions crew. And with me this evening is a brand new co-host who will be on board for the as yet unknown duration of the Atavachron series. It is my great pleasure to introduce the incomparable Claire Little.
Hello, thank you. I didn't know that I was incomparable.
I think you're incomparable.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Oh, well, we are very happy to have you here. And if you're familiar with Claire's voice, she was on an episode a couple of weeks ago talking about the 2015 Las Vegas Star Trek convention. So that we teased this during that discussion, and this is the first episode of that new series. So, Claire, if you want, let's take a few minutes to get the audience on board with what we're doing here with Atavachron. Oftentimes we, as Trek fans, I think we find ourselves talking about all of the effects that Star Trek has had on our own world and our own lives and the things that it's influenced in technology. But I think that it would be an interesting discussion to flip it around and look at it the other way and see what parts of our world have influenced Star Trek.
Yeah, exactly. This series started out kind of just as a discussion between the two of us at the convention. And originally we thought we were going to focus mainly on literature and literary influence on Star Trek, but we both kind of quickly realized that it's a lot bigger than that.
Mm-hmm.
You know, any discussion about literature is going to end up becoming a discussion about history or social issues or technology. And so why not bring all of that to this podcast instead of limiting ourselves to technology? So I think it's going to be really interesting to see how Star Trek takes real world issues or historical items or takes a look at a culture, for example, and sort of turns that on its head for an episode of Star Trek.
Exactly. Like Claire was saying, it could be literature, of course, but, you know, wars have featured prominently in Star Trek before, historical figures and things from our own real world. And what kind of insights can we gain into Star Trek by looking at it from that perspective? So, Claire, I just want to roll back to the convention real quick and talk a little bit about the panel that you were part of that kind of spurred this conversation between us.
Yeah, so I was asked to take part by Amy Imhoff, who put this panel together. I was asked to take part in a panel looking at literary influence in Star Trek. And I was really honored to be able to have that opportunity, and it just got me thinking, and I really enjoyed doing that panel. And so, like I mentioned earlier, this podcast kind of became an extension of that, but then it became something bigger. So just as literature contains, obvious references and metaphors based on the real world and our history and our culture, we wanted to be able to talk about that in our podcast. We didn't get to talk about that in the panel, but like I said, preparing for the panel got me thinking about a lot of those ideas.
And that's what got me thinking about it as well. So one more thing that I want to mention about the Atavachron series. Actually, wait a minute. There's 2 things. One thing that I'm particularly excited about, because this is going to be the first time in Tricorder Transmissions history in the 2 years we've been running, where we're planning to be able to branch out from the original series. So we are going to be covering quite a bit of original series episodes up front with the Atavachron show, but we've also been talking about where we're going to go down the road. So no series is off the table. No movie is off the table at this point. So if you've been feeling a little hamstrung listening to our show for a couple of years because we've been sticking with original series, fear not. We're going to branch out down the road a little ways. And Claire is going to give me a hand in some of the series that I'm not as familiar with as she is. So I'm hoping I can lean on her extreme amount of knowledge. And I think all of you will be suitably impressed with that.
Thank you. And if you want to branch out into the animated series, I will have to go back and actually watch that for the first time. So it's not going to be a one-way issue. I've never watched the animated series.
Oh, all right. Well, we have yet to actually cover the animated series. That's in our plans shortly down the road in our commentary series. But I've watched them all, so I'd be more than happy to help out in that regard. And right. I think before we jump into our first discussion, I wanted to quickly talk about where the name of the show came from, because it was Claire's idea to name the show Atavachron, and I'm sure many people listening to this are familiar with what the Atavachron is, but I think it kind of really fits what we're doing here.
Yeah, so the Atavachron is the name of I'm just going to call it a time library in the original series episode All Our Yesterdays. I believe it's the second to last episode of the entire series. You might recall that it's the one in which Spock and McCoy get sort of stuck in a Ice Age time frame on another planet, and Spock begins to devolve and act differently because he becomes kind of an ancient Vulcan in terms of his emotional volatility. But the Atavachron itself, this building that essentially allows people to travel to any time in this planet's past, is a really interesting idea to me. And in the show, it's actually it allows the inhabitants of this planet to escape a catastrophe. There's an apocalyptic type disaster in their present, and so instead of preventing the disaster, they simply go back in time and continue to live their lives simply in a time before the disaster. And so it allows them to sort of experience their own past with the perspectives of what was their present, which is now their future. It's, as a time travel episode, of course, there's a lot of confusion, and I thought it was a good kind of metaphor for hopefully what we're going to get out of this podcast series.
Exactly. It's very, very fitting. So thanks for running through that. And we are going to be covering today an episode from the second season of Star Trek, the original series, and that would be The Piece of the Action. So the reason why we're going to be covering this is because, in a nutshell, the story revolves around a society that once existed on its own, but was altered by the teachings of a book left behind by some Starfleet visitors, so that the society becomes a version of itself based on the Chicago mobs of the 1920s. So, Claire, you picked this one as our first episode. Can you tell us a little bit about why you did that?
Sure. So when I picked this episode, initially, we were just going to be focusing on literary influence. And I thought that because the plot of this episode revolves around a society directly modeling itself on a book, it would give us a nice opportunity to examine exactly what kinds of literary influence can come into a piece of fiction. And of course, we have Star Trek, which is itself a work of fiction, looking at what happens when a society models itself on a work of, in this case, it's not fiction, but it's a book. And there's some really interesting bits of interplay between, you basically have fictional characters looking through books and thinking about the idea of living in a sort of fictional or artificial world. So I thought it would be interesting. But of course, as I watched it, and I know, Jeff, as you watched it as well, we both realized that there's a lot more to unpack than just a literary angle.
Excited to get into this. So I'm going to read off a synopsis of the episode to refresh everybody's memory in case you are not familiar with a piece of the action. So this is from an NBC press release that was issued back in 1967 before the show actually ran. The superior technology of the Enterprise crew is temporarily unable to cope with the gangster tactics of planet Iotia 2. Captain Kirk, Mr. Spock, and Dr. McCoy beam down to Iotia to check rumors that the development of a planet was halted by the moral decay 100 years before. They learn the source of the problem is a book on Chicago mobs of the 20s, which the Iotians have adopted as their Bible. The bosses among them, Oxmix, Krako and Kalo are the most powerful, have their hoods and henchmen, and the populace pays for protection. Kirk employs gangster tactics against them. So, since you picked this topic, Claire, why don't you kick us off with our first discussion point?
All right. So I think I will take this opportunity to dive a little bit into kind of the literary side of things. I know that this episode maybe is sometimes not well received. It's a little silly. The characters behave strangely. Spock behaves, as the episode goes on, increasingly out of character. And Kirk hams it up like Shatner has never hammed it up before by the end of the episode with his really amazing gangster accent and vocabulary. But I actually think that it's maybe not a deep episode, but it is a more important episode than it might initially appear. The very first scene, everyone on the Enterprise is fully aware of how absurd the situation is. While Kirk is having a conversation with Oxmix, Uhura is openly giggling. There's an unnamed science officer in the background grinning at how ridiculous Oxmix sounds, and how confused and sort of bewildered Kirk is at the communication. This episode knows that it's silly. Everyone on the Enterprise knows that they're encountering a completely absurd and bizarre society, even before they know why it's bizarre or exactly how bizarre it is. In essence, I think it represents very well the characters from two different books or two different works of fiction swapping worlds. So when Kirk, Spock, and McCoy beam down, initially they're very surprised and unsure of themselves. They see people walking around openly armed. There's a mob hit happens right after they beam down. They're immediately confronted by two men with Tommy guns. It's an alarming situation. I think in any other episode, Kirk, Spock, and McCoy would be a lot more serious in their alarm, but instead they're really just confused. They're clearly out of their element and out of place. After speaking with Oxmix for a few minutes, Kirk, number one, realizes that this is not the mission that he expected it to be. He's not there to simply clean up the Federation's mistakes. He's there at the invitation of Oxmix, who hopes that Kirk will provide him with weaponry, or heaters, as Oxmix repeatedly calls the phasers. And Kirk appears blatantly annoyed. He is pretty much rolling his eyes at how ridiculous the situation is, and he appears impatient with it. Kirk may not be known as maybe as strong a diplomat as someone like Captain Picard in later series, but Kirk is certainly a diplomat. You know, it's a bit of cowboy diplomacy, but diplomacy is still there. In this case, I think Kirk is clearly just done with it. He's figured it out. These people are ridiculous. He wants to go back up to the ship and leave. He just is not interested in this story at all. But he's stuck there. And it's not until he, and eventually Spock and McCoy as well, realize that he has to play by the gangsters' rules. He has to essentially play out the plot of this episode according to the rules of the fiction that he's now in on this planet. It's not until he realizes that he can succeed in cleaning up the situation, which is his mission, but also leaving orbit and being able to be done with the whole mess. As would happen in later series, it's basically Kirk getting stuck on the holodeck and having to play out the holo novel or the holodeck fiction before the doors will open and let him out. This is, in my opinion, the very first holodeck episode without a holodeck. So as the episode goes on, it does become more and more ridiculous. You have Scotty and Uhura, trying to decipher increasingly strange communications from the captain, because the captain is communicating in gangster speak, because he's being listened to. At some point, Scotty actually asks Uhura for a translation because he's so confused. And Spock becomes increasingly out of character. He begins to tell jokes. He actually begins to use some of the gangster language himself and appears to be enjoying himself as much as Spock would show that. Surprisingly, McCoy, who's maybe in a different episode would have been the person to embrace this role a little more than Spock, he is actually the voice of reason and logic more than anyone else by the end of the episode. He's the most subdued of the three and the most passive, which is interesting to me. So to wrap up a point that I think has sort of taken me a little long to get there, I think we end up seeing Kirk, Spock, and McCoy becoming different characters because they are in a different fiction. And this world, sort of this planet, brings this difference out in them by necessity, because it's the only way that they can sort of get back to their own fiction is by completing the storyline of this other fiction on the planet.
Yeah, I really like the parallel between the holodeck episodes, especially the ones in Next Gen, where you had to play out the entire scenario before it would let you out. So Kirk and Spock finally figure out that they have to assimilate into this society and actually they can retain some parts of themselves, but essentially they have to become something that they're not in order to enact a plan that will get them out of that scenario. And whether or not that plan makes any sense, it's an interesting character exercise to see how they're struggling at the beginning with dealing with this society and how they come to grips with the fact that you have to join them to beat them.
Exactly. There's an internal logic to the planet that they have to embrace and begin to sort of work by, even if it is completely illogical according to their Star Trek universe logic or Federation universe logic. Again, it's like they've been placed into a completely different show or different work of fiction.
Exactly. And at the beginning, you clearly see them approaching this problem from their standard Starfleet position and using their already established characters and already established knowledge about the universe and how they exercise their missions. But you start to see over time that their experience wouldn't necessarily help them because they're almost fish out of water from the second they set foot on the planet.
Absolutely. Just a few moments or a few scenes before Kirk finally begins to embrace this sort of other logic, Spock and McCoy are having a conversation, and Spock says, "Logic and practical information do not seem to apply here." And it's absolutely right. And it's from that point forward that Spock, McCoy, and Kirk are finally able to actually take some control in the situation by embracing the absurdity of it and just going with it. They have to play the roles that all of the other characters on the gangster planet are expecting them to play, that they previously had not been playing because they're not their natural roles.
You know, something that kind of stood out to me a bit when I rewatched this episode to discuss this with you from a different perspective was that while they assimilate themselves more and more into the gangster culture, they start to forsake some of the things that they normally rely on. So instead of walking around carrying phasers in their hands, they're walking around with the Tommy guns. They never actually fire them, but you would think that they have superior technology available to them, yet they're reluctant to use it.
Exactly. They have to blend in as they're walking around down the street, Kirk insisting on driving that car, even though he clearly does not know how to drive a car beyond maybe principle. They're insisting on looking the part and playing the part and acting the part. I mean, Kirk's accent gets more and more amazing as the episode goes on, far beyond probably where it even needs to go. He probably could have stopped adopting this grandiose persona about halfway before where he did, and he probably would have blended in just fine. But at some point, the characterization sort of runs away with them. Again, with Spock, he actually begins to do things that are far beyond him simply being a Starfleet officer who's improvising in a situation. He really becomes almost a different character. And he probably didn't need to quite go that far in order for the plan to work, but it's sort of they got carried away.
From a character study perspective, what does it say about Kirk's adaptability and his willingness to carry things to extremes in order to blend in with the society in order to escape a situation? The fact that he was quickly able to become a mobster, a gangster, and how quickly he picked up the lingo and the mannerisms necessary.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. What would he have done if he had been in a situation where he needed to fire one of those guns? How far can you go in the name of playing a role in order to achieve an ultimate goal that is noble? If you have to do something that goes against your Starfleet training in order to achieve that goal, how what are the rules? What are the limits? Could he have, if he was asked to participate in a mob hit, would he have done that if he knew that ultimately it would allow him to achieve the Federation sanctioned goal and carry out his mission? I don't know. I would think not, but
Well, I would think the answer to that question is in the episode itself, because every time that Kirk has the opportunity to use the gun on somebody, and Spock in the same vein, they drop the guns and resort to fisticuffs. in order to take people
That's
out.
true.
So
That's very true.
I don't think that, and there's not one phaser blast that is set to kill in this episode. The only phaser blasts from the ship or from the hand phasers are all to stun. So
That's very true.
I don't think Kirk or Spock or McCoy would have actually pulled a trigger on one of those guns.
You know, and that brings up a really good point, which is for all the ways that those three characters kind of become these different characters while they're in this gangster universe, ultimately they are fully aware of what they're doing and what their actions are. They don't completely lose sight of themselves because they realize that in a world where killing people willy-nilly is sort of standard operating procedure, there's actually more power in choosing not to kill your enemy. And they keep that in mind, and they're able to use that power to impress the other gang leaders.
And in so doing, they stay true to themselves, even though they have to alter their behavior to fit the scenario. They don't lose sight of themselves.
And the very final communication that Kirk has with the ship before the big climactic scene with the phaser blast from orbit that's set to stun, the communication has two parts. First, Kirk is speaking to Scotty in the heaviest of the gang slang and gang accent that he probably ever uses in the entire episode, and Scotty does not understand him at all. And then Kirk blinks, pauses a moment, and then speaks in the natural, normal Kirk cadence that we all expect, without using any slang, without using any accent. He speaks to Scotty in his true voice. Scotty, of course, understands and carries out his orders, but you see that true Kirk has been there all along inside, underneath this ridiculous persona.
And he doesn't lose himself, and he can switch it on and off whenever he wants to or needs to when a need arises. So a little bit more about this topic before we move on to something else. Speaking of the Enterprise crew versus the Iotian gangsters, there's obviously a great difference in the intelligence level of one side versus the other, and technology differences between one side and the other. In relation to any sort of literature that you have in mind in your body of knowledge, is this story of a superior force being confronted with a lesser force that gives them a lot of trouble, but the superior force winds up winning in the end? Is that a common story arc?
I think I would say common, or at least an interesting or an intriguing story arc. Not just in literary fiction, but in films and television as well. How many James Bond films have there been that are predicated on Bond and an equally clever villain, or a villain who thinks he's equally clever, but ultimately is not, getting the upper hand at first, and Bond falters and is nearly killed or is nearly stymied or is locked up or whatever events are happening to him, just so that the tables can be turned and our hero can be victorious. I think that is something that turn and then counterpoint of victory and defeat, or defeat and victory, I guess, is something that's been present in literature for as long as there has been literature. I mean, there are so many examples of that in ancient literature, from Gilgamesh to the Bible, the Greek epics. There's plenty of it. A more concrete example would be the different worlds that Gulliver encounters in Gulliver's Travels. In some cases, he's physically much larger and much larger than the people in the world where he is. When he visits the Lilliputians, for example, they're very small, but he is initially completely overpowered by them. It takes thousands of them and all the rope in the kingdom in order to lash him down, but they do succeed in doing it, even though he's physically far superior to them. And then there's the reverse. At some point, he's tiny and he's in a land of giants, but ultimately he's always able to escape or prevail, although he's not usually in an actual contest with these people. It's not a villainous or an antagonistic relationship, but it is still him needing to be able to leave.
I've often wondered, watching a lot of these Star Trek episodes that I've been doing commentaries on for a while, and thinking back on other stories that I'd read in the past and other movies and shows that had similar storylines. So I'm sure we're going to come across a lot of these things as we move forward with this series that we're doing.
I mean, it wouldn't be very interesting television or any sort of fiction if the hero was immediately seen to be victorious and there was never any question in your mind as a reader or viewer that they were going to be able to win. I mean, There has to be the potential that the hero might lose in order for you to be excited and happy for them when they win.
The absurdity of a piece of the action at times, it kind of takes me out of that mindset. And you almost scratch your head sometimes thinking how Kirk and Spock and McCoy could just walk into these types of situations, especially because they do it more than once in the episode, referring specifically to Spock and McCoy being double crossed again and being duped into beaming back down and immediately being captured. So, you'd think with the body of experience that they had, that wouldn't happen.
That's a really interesting point. And I think because McCoy and Spock kind of reverse roles in this episode, it almost makes sense that they would commit these blunders that you don't think they should commit, simply because each of them is new at their role. When Spock and McCoy beam back down, McCoy is the one who says to Spock, it's likely we're going to be double crossed. And Spock says, well, we don't really have much choice, so we're going to have to cross our fingers, basically, and hope that we don't get double crossed. And of course, they're immediately double crossed. And McCoy says, see, I told you so. But in a much more subdued and frankly Spock-like manner than McCoy's usual see, I told you so's are. It's not gloating. It's a very kind of subdued comment. And Kirk even comments on the fact that Spock essentially took a leap of faith by beaming down, and Spock does not deny it. So it's interesting that the two of them kind of reverse roles.
Yeah, McCoy doesn't have his normal angry outbursts in this. He
just stands there.
Yeah, quiet contemplation and little comments here and there. So he becomes more Spock-like. But Spock doesn't necessarily always become more McCoy-like, because he's kind of a strange takeoff of himself.
He is. Yeah, I wouldn't say he becomes McCoy-like, but compared to his typical Spock self, he does more. There's a lot more intuition and sort of gut to his choices and decisions than usual. Thinking of the Galileo 7, when he is confronted at the end with the fact that he basically made a gut decision, he flatly denies it. He will not admit it, even though it's true. Yes. And in this episode, you see him doing it and admitting it, and basically saying, well, whatever, we'll see if it works. He's very casual about it.
Very un-Spock-like. Yeah, good point. A lot of things to dig into with these strange takeoffs on the characters. And near the end, when Spock is at his most gangsterish, he clearly seems to be trying, but he just can't seem to muster the same level as Kirk is able to. And McCoy doesn't even try.
And exactly. I almost think Kirk knows that he needs to carry Spock's performance, so he ratchets his own up to whole new levels. I wonder if McCoy, just as a passive observer in most of this episode, sort of sees that Kirk is laying it on so thick that there's no need whatsoever for McCoy to even bother
what's
trying.
What's he going to do?
Yeah, I mean, Kirk's got all the attention on him, and so he's got it covered. I don't know if that's what McCoy is thinking, but I do think that Kirk at least initially realizes he needs to kind of coax Spock along and cover for some of Spock's deficiencies. That said, I don't have it written down, but Spock actually uses some of the gangster slang right at the end.
He does.
And he doesn't need to. He interjects in a conversation that he's really not part of. Just so he can use this slang. I'm not sure why he does it, but I thought it was very interesting.
Well, he needed something else to do, but I think Spock turns out to be what I would think is a pretty good yes man, though, because every good mobster needs a yes man to co-sign on everything he's saying, and Spock certainly can say right pretty well, because he does it several times. So everybody needs a good yes man every now and then. So Spock wasn't completely useless.
Oh no, not at all. He's also comic relief in a much different capacity than he usually is. I think usually he's the butt of jokes, but in this case, he is actually the joker. And Kirk is the butt of a lot of the jokes, especially the ones about driving the car.
Yes.
So it's very interesting.
And I think this is the episode that made Gene Roddenberry say no more comedy in Star Trek. So after Trouble with Tribbles and then this one, I think that's when he drew the line on comedy in Star Trek. Intentional comedy.
Yeah. I have to say, I really like a piece of the action. I can understand, though, why people may not like it or might think it kind of wears out its welcome a little bit, but I enjoy it. I mean, the Fizz bin, I think all the comedy works in it. That said, there's other comedy in Star Trek that I think fails spectacularly. So I guess it's all a matter of taste.
Yes, I'm sure we'll get to some of those episodes down the road as we move through some more of our episodes here. So you want to get into the actual book itself? I think there's so much meat to get into in the actual book. So the Chicago Mobs of the 1920s book, which is the book that the Iotians based their gangster society on, but not fully. So in a pre-conversation that Claire and I were having, she brought up a very interesting point that they kind of seem to go halfway with it. So it seems to be a like a Capone family style mafia takeoff, but they didn't create the opposite side. They didn't create the police, the FBI, any of the normal enemies of the mob or the quote unquote good guys. So this is a society based solely on the bad guys.
Yeah, it's not, a couple of times the Federation is referred to as the Feds, but I don't get the impression that they were expecting these last 100 years that the Feds were watching or would come back at any time. The gangsters don't appear the least bit concerned that the Feds are there. They see the Feds as basically an ammo dispensary.
Exactly.
An opportunity, not a villain or an enemy.
It's interesting to me that they completely omitted any sort of opposition, because you would think that naturally in a society that exists prior to a change like this, that there would be people who weren't okay with the change, who may naturally have become the opposition to this new mob regime, right? So you would think that somewhere on the planet, there would be pockets of dissenters who would want to still live the old ways, right?
I was actually thinking about this earlier today, which is, so it's mentioned that there are 12 gang kingpins. They don't say on the planet, they just say that there are 12 others and Oxmix wants to take over their territory. So I was trying to wonder, or trying to think, how widespread is this gang culture? Is it the only culture on the planet? And let's just say it's an Earth analog. So are there 12 governments on a planet of 7 billion people? Which is, if so, far fewer governments than we have now today here on Earth. So they've actually consolidated a lot more already compared to us. Or is this just a little peninsula somewhere that's got these 12 gangster governments? Or is it a single town that has 12 gangs operating in it? I couldn't figure that one out.
I think the only indication we have into that is something you have to extrapolate from watching the episode itself. And that, it would be, in my mind, that's the proximity between Oxmix and Krakow's headquarters. They're relatively close together. So I think that at least the two of them, we see the other bosses teleported in, or beamed in rather, at the end of the episode, but we're not really sure where exactly they are in relation to Krakow and Oxmix, who are the two biggest bosses. And I think near the beginning, doesn't Oxmix say that he controls the biggest territory?
He does, but I don't recall that they ever explain what that means in terms of size or number of inhabitants. Another thing is, as they're at some point, while I'm not sure if it's Kirk, McCoy, or Spock, or all three of them, one of them or all of them are walking down the street with somebody's henchmen. Honestly, I don't remember if it's Oxmix or Krakow, but these two women walk up and they're just regular neighborhood ladies, and they're complaining about the level of government service, basically. And they say, we pay our dues and we're not getting, the service that we expect.
Right.
And it's essentially the equivalent of taxpayers complaining that, the streets aren't clean or something. It's a low level issue, but it implies that these gangs are taking care of sort of standard of living type issues that a traditional government might take care of. And also that these two women walk right up and talk to the henchman and mention, we're not getting what we want. And the henchman doesn't say, well, write your local representative. He basically just says, well, you get what you pay for, or something he brushes them off somehow. But there's a real level of familiarity there.
Exactly.
That there, I don't get the impression that there are, 500 million people in Oxmix's territory that he's responsible for.
Right.
If these two women just walk right up and complain that they're not getting what they are paying their dues for.
Right. And there's no easily identifiable insignias or styles of dress or uniforms that would denote whose men are whose. So obviously those women knew who those henchmen were. So that's more of like a local thing, you know.
Exactly.
You always see that in, you know, all the different mob movies where, you know, the same couple of henchmen walk into the same newsstand and shake the guy down every week for his protection money. So, and there's a local familiarity there.
Exactly.
So something else that I think those two women might have hinted at is a class system at work in this society. So obviously they're two, you know, either lower class or lower middle class, you know, apartment dwellers who are reliant on the mob boss who acts as the government. So there's definitely different levels. They don't seem to have a vehicle. They don't drive up. They kind of just walk over. So, you know, but they are dressed well.
Yeah, everyone seems to be dressed well. And I don't just mean the suits. You know, even the women as they're walking down the street, they're all dressed sort of well, but it's kind of like a tacky version of well. It's a slightly maybe intensified version of what must be described in that book as the clothing of the time of, you know, the women who would hang out with the gangsters that were up there. I don't know. It may also just be a product of the production of the show. It might not have been an intentional choice to have the women kind of all wearing cocktail hour outfits from the 1930s and 20s and 30s. True. Kind of like everyone looks like a glorified flapper sort of. And I don't know if that was an intentional choice or if it was just a matter of what costumes were available.
Probably.
You know, for the production. But, so.
Yeah. It kind of fits the extreme narrative, how far they take the concept and how almost overboard they go with it. So the clothing just seems a natural fit. But jumping back to the book, I mean, there's so many things that we can delve into, and I think you just started to delve into one thing that I wanted to bring up, and this is kind of a huge compound topic, but the clothing being something that's dictated in the book makes me wonder what exactly would have to be in that book. I mean, we see the physical book, and it's quite large, but what would actually have to be written and drawn and described in that book that would give you enough information to create not only a society, but a dialect of the English language, assuming they spoke English to begin with, buildings, vehicles, weapons, clothing, all of that stuff would have to be outlined in the book for them to be able to assimilate it into their society. So what exactly is in that book? And not only is what's in the book, is the current level of technological capability of that society when they assimilate that book would have to be good enough to be able to manufacture the stuff that they needed, right? So I think Spock said they were in like an early industrial age. So it may have made sense for some of the items to be able to be manufactured, but I'm not so sure about maybe the cars and the Tommy guns. I'm not sure how advanced they were. Obviously, they were advanced enough to create them, but I'm wondering, what would the book have to include?
I would think, at some point, that book would have to include just massive amounts of information, all the way from metallurgy to, you know, basic principles of chemistry. I mean, it would have to include a heck of a lot.
Exactly.
You know, the patterns for clothing, apparently they have petroleum on this planet.
I was just thinking that, yeah.
You know, they had a history that included this, you know, a similar geological history to Earth, that they were able to have, you know, combustion engines based on hydrocarbons. And I mean, it becomes a little ridiculous unless maybe you open everything up and it's got completely different innards. So the Tommy guns actually are completely different on the inside, but I don't know.
Oh, that's an interesting thought.
Yeah, I mean, the car might have looked exactly like an old car, but the actual propulsion mechanism maybe was totally different. Although the clutch and everything operated the same, and it had a reverse. Yeah, so No, but that's actually a really interesting way to think about it, because I hadn't looked at it from that perspective before. So maybe the book only has the external appearances of these items, and the Iotians created them
in the image of what they saw in the book, based on their
Right.
level of capability.
I mean, maybe so. Because at the end of the episode, Kirk or Spock or McCoy realize that they have accidentally left a communicator
Yes.
behind. And they all kind of look at each other, and it's almost like, if you don't tell, I won't tell, and they say to each other, given how much ingenuity these people have, that one communicator, which has in it the basic tenets of all our technology, let's come back in 100 years, they could be where we are now. And so, and have all of the sort of typical Federation Starfleet technology just from that one component, which normally I would say they were exaggerating, but considering how successful they were at emulating everything about Chicago gangster society, maybe they're not.
Yeah, I that was the one part of the episode where I kind of threw my hands up and said, why don't you just turn the ship around and go back and get it? It wouldn't be that complicated.
I know.
And they should be able to just beam the communicator back up. They could just get a fix on it and beam it back up. Just go get it.
And there's a very unusual, this is a bit of a side topic, but it's a really weird level of surprise and lack of surprise between for the different people seeing Kirk and Spock and McCoy beam down. It's like and seeing phasers. The gangster, it's very opportunistic, which is totally in keeping with the whole gangster thing. But instead of being shocked and amazed at the fact that these three people materialized out of thin air carrying weapons that are far, far superior to anything else, they're not shocked by it. They're not like, oh, these people are from heaven, or they're devils, or they're aliens. They just look at that and go, okay, but how can that benefit me? What can I get out of this? At one point, I believe it's Oxmix says to some other henchmen in the room, hey, check this out. And then Spock and McCoy, I think so it's Krakow, Spock and McCoy beam down. So Krakow knows that his henchmen have never seen anything like a transporter, but they're not even that blown away by it. They're kind of just like, oh, that was different. And they show no shock.
True. Two points that stem from that. Number one is there's a disproportionate amount of shock and awe on the part of the henchmen when they beam Krakow out and up into the ship. So they run over and look at where he was and, trying to see if there's like a little globule of something on the floor left of him or something. But
I'm sorry, I'm thinking of Spinal Tap. The word globule only.
That's where I was going.
One thing for me.
That's where I was going. It's about the slime molds and the
it is.
and the drummers that leave a globule behind. Sorry, people, that was a little side note there. Spinal Tap's a whole nother podcast. But the second point, and this is something that I remember talking about on the commentary episode when we did Piece of the Action, a year ago. This is something that I thought was really, really cool. Is while McCoy and Spock are in the process of beaming down, one of the henchmen actually says something to the effect of, don't worry, they can't do anything until they stop sparkling. So they were smart enough to know that McCoy and Spock couldn't draw their phasers until they were fully materialized. So they had a distinct advantage over McCoy and Spock because of the amount of time it takes you to complete the transport, which I think really shows that you think these are kind of bumbling idiots, but they actually do have a degree of intelligence.
They do, and that sort of underpins the idea that these people are somehow super capable of understanding and assimilating and reproducing alien technology. And the fact that they're pretty quickly used to this really unusual technological incidents and items that they're seeing, that kind of explains to a certain extent how they were able to be so successful so quickly at recreating the Chicago gangster world. It doesn't really explain why they really liked the Chicago gangster culture or lifestyle, but it does kind of put aside the fact that, or allow you to put aside the fact that, you would expect them as a group to just sit around in complete awe at the fact that they had just met aliens, 100 years ago. They seem to get over it really quickly and just sort of move right on to, okay, but what's next? How can we use it? How does it work? We understand it. Let's make some of our own.
I think that it's illustrated immediately upon the first beam down when the henchmen come to meet Kirk, Spock, and McCoy in the streets and are not even remotely intimidated by them. Immediately assume the upper hand.
Yeah, and there are other people in the street walking around, and
Mhm.
the most alarming thing that happens in that scene is a drive-by shooting.
And they're more
that has
scared of that,
nothing
right?
to do. Yeah, it has nothing to do with Kirk, Spock, or McCoy.
Right, they see that all the time, every day, and when you see three guys materialize in the street, you would think, you would immediately, if I saw three guys materialize in the street, I think I'd be shocked and kind of standing staring for a while and trying to process what I just saw.
Right.
But so looping back to the book a little bit here, because there's so many more things to talk about. So another fascinating topic that I picked up on is the fact that this book is actually alien in origin. So nobody on Iosha wrote this book. It was left there by some Starfleet officers from another ship 100 years ago. And it's amazing to me that this society would, who was the first person to pick up that book and get the idea that they should completely alter their society based on this alien book?
I mean, yeah, and I'd love to know, did someone on this previous ship, I cannot remember the name of the ship.
The Horizon, I believe.
Horizon. Okay. Did someone from the Horizon who was just happened to be reading that book in their own time, I guess, just happen to call over an inhabitant and say, "Hey, check out this. Let me read this paragraph to you. It's really interesting." Or, I mean, how did the original dissemination occur?
And this is another one of those situations where you wonder how English is so prevalent throughout the universe of Star Trek, and the fact that the people on that planet, number one, could read and comprehend the book that was written in English, means they must have been speaking English prior, and the book must have given them some sort of way to translate or at least understand what the slang that they were adopting meant.
Mm-hmm.
And also, not only that, but the pronunciations and the way that you have to say those words in order for them to sound authentic.
I mean, so this was 100 years prior, and I know Kirk at some point mentions they didn't really have the Prime Directive at that point. Things were different because Spock and McCoy both say, "How did this happen in the first place?" The Horizon should have known better or differently. It kind of makes you wonder, and since obviously the original series was written before Enterprise was written, disregarding the fact that some of these questions are sort of answered or addressed in the series Enterprise, really makes you wonder how different the Federation was 100 years prior. Maybe this wasn't just a casual accidental contamination. Maybe they sat down intentionally intending to teach people to speak English, or it's more of almost a cultural missionary type effort.
That's an interesting
I don't know.
point. Yeah, well, that's true. We've seen other Trek episodes where corrupt Starfleet officers will assume power over a society that's, inferior to them and alter that society to fit the corrupt person's needs or whims, right? So it's entirely possible that the people from that Horizon ship, the ship did explode later on so that they couldn't be asked or tracked down. But the fact is that they may have been there with ulterior motives and in an attempt to shape and mold the society into something else.
It may not even have been corrupt or intentionally bad. I mean, there are countless examples in our own past of people, the entire colonial experience is about one culture coming in and helping another culture and improving their situation because these poor natives are, I'm saying all this sarcastically, these poor natives are in hovels and aren't we superior because we've got better stuff?
Exactly.
Let's show them how to do things our way and make them not speak their language. They should speak our language. And it's, the intention is good on the part of the people who are performing these sort of missionary efforts. It's not a warlike conquering. It's more of a cultural conquering. But again, it's one of those, they meant well, even if the consequences are not so great. So it's very possible that maybe there was an addendum to the exploration. It wasn't just an exploration for the sake of exploring. It was an exploration for the sake of spreading Earth-like or Federation-like values. I don't know. I mean, how many times, especially in the Next Generation forward, has there been an incident where breaking the prime directive would have saved a bunch of people or improved their situation in some way, but you couldn't do it because you would be breaking the prime directive. It's,
Exactly.
whether you're doing it for good or bad, the result is the same. It's a non-interference policy that you can't break, even though they do break it sometimes.
Yeah. Well, it supposedly from the context of the episode, the corruption happened prior to the non-interference policy being enacted, which gives Kirk, Spock, and McCoy a little bit of a disadvantage when they come back to check out the situation and try to remedy it. But
And there's the sense almost of guilt about it. I mean, several times, McCoy, I believe it's McCoy, early on says, well, why don't we just leave? I mean, they're doing their thing. It's the contamination is far too extensive to clean it up at this point. Let's just go. And Kirk says, no, we have an obligation to try and fix this.
Which
and
they don't.
So they don't fix the cultural contamination, but they try to fix the infighting by basically having a unified government. But again, there's this sense, and it'd be interesting to know, is Kirk's sense of obligation out of the fact that the Horizon itself did something wrong, or the fact that the Federation as a whole used to operate differently in a way that is now kind of opposite to the Federation's ideals? I don't know.
And what does Kirk's report back to Starfleet look like?
I don't know, but I guarantee you he fudged the inventory for their communicators.
I wouldn't doubt it. But the accidental impact, the accidental societal change is an interesting thought, because we've seen that in other Trek episodes in the original series. And I'm thinking specifically of Patterns of Force, where Nazi Germany becomes a thing by accident. So it wasn't an intentional thing. It was kind of listen, I'm going to teach you some things about things that happened in Earth's past, and I'm going to give you the positives and the negatives of this society. And then, oops, now I'm incapacitated, and you guys take it to an extreme, which is entirely possible. That's what happened on Iosha as well. Yeah,
and I believe in Patterns of Force, the Federation guy meant well.
Yep.
Again, he simply thought that these people needed a little more social structure. He was not intending to actually implement Nazism, but he used the example of Nazis as a teaching tool. The lesson was misunderstood, or the wrong parts of it were taken and grabbed onto. Again, it's if the consequences are bad, doesn't matter what the intentions were.
That's a good point. But it's fun to explore what the intentions might have been, because it's
absolutely.
really never revealed fully. So we only know the results at the end. So the change in the society on Iosha, it's implied that the change wasn't forced on them, that they adopted it willingly, which I thought was also pretty interesting. I was wondering to myself if in the society that existed prior, if they maintained the same structure, the same class structure. So whoever was rich prior to the change became the bosses and the top level people, and whoever was poor prior stayed at the bottom, and whoever the laborers were stayed the laborers. They don't really delve into the full structure of the society. They just focus mostly on the bosses and their henchmen, and you get some glimpses into the lower classes, but we don't know what manual labor looks like. We don't know what factory labor looks like. We don't know what other forms of commerce look like in this world. So I'm not sure how to even approach the topic, but did you have any thoughts about what the society might have been like prior?
Well, I don't know necessarily I haven't really thought about what the society itself was like prior, but just thinking about Earth history, dramatic, and revolutions that include dramatic social change and ideological change, they usually seem to come from the lower classes. And until you build this sort of critical mass of support for this change, and then, it can kind of, just thinking about, for example, the Soviet Union, you had the revolutionary uprising, which came, I believe, from the lower classes. Of course, they deposed the Tsar and murdered the Tsar and his family, and it became this, government of the people kind of thing. But eventually there was a critical mass that happened such that you had a large enough number of people supporting this new cause and being entrenched in the power structure of this new cause, that they could then kind of steamroll everybody else who was left, who didn't necessarily support this new cause. I can't imagine that it would simply be a top-down kind of, let's just paint this new culture on top of our old culture without any changes. I mean, it just doesn't seem like that's how revolutions happen on Earth.
Great points.
Then again, who knows what this is a different planet, so.
No, but I think that's a very valid point and a valid way of looking at it. So you could theorize that maybe Oxmix and Krakow and some of the other bosses were lower class guys, and maybe the entire movement started at the bottom. Maybe they got a hold of that book and started to follow it and work their way up through the system and wound up pushing out the people who were actually in power at the time.
Right. Or this is maybe the second or third generation on from the initial change. I mean, it's been 100 years. I don't know that the change necessarily began happening the day after the Horizon left. So there could have been some delay there. But if Oxmix, maybe he was not involved, or he was a child at the time of the original change, he kind of knew how to play the power. Obviously, he was interested in power. He knew how to play the game. He may have just sort of worked his way up. You know, he may have been a henchman for the previous leader of his territory and inherited it either because he was given the blessing to be the new guy, or because maybe he killed his previous boss. I mean, I don't know. It's because it's the whole gangster thing. It kind of seems like any tactics are possible, because you can run around killing people and nobody seems to care that much. So
yeah, they just step over your corpse as they're walking down the street. But
yeah, pretty much.
There's a quasi age stamp on Oxmix himself very early in the episode, because he seems to be extremely familiar with the Horizon and the fact that it left 100 years ago. And they don't really talk about how they age on that planet, but it seems to me that there's a possibility that they have a longer lifespan than we do. Because if it was 100 years ago, I'm not sure if the dialogue that Oxmix relates in relation to the Horizon would have been delivered the same way. I mean, it just seemed like he was intimately familiar with the ship itself and what they had done there, and was surprised that it took so long for another ship to show up.
That kind of explains why he's not at all surprised or amazed at people beaming down into his office, and his henchmen as well. Even if his henchmen were not there for the Horizon, he may have explained it to them as someone who'd seen it personally himself, told them what to expect.
Exactly.
So that they're not amazed. Interestingly, Krakow is totally amazed when he's in the transporter room of the Enterprise. He is completely a fish out of water. Tables are turned. I don't think he ever was on the Horizon based on his reaction of being on the Enterprise.
I get the impression that they're all people who've just been on surface dwellers for the whole time, but some of them were more familiar with the technology from the Horizon ship than others were. So I think that it is possible to have a fish out of water if you beam them up to an unfamiliar place, but if you have them on their own turf, that you almost can't phase them.
Well, yeah, and it's near the end when Kirk is trying to convince the 12 bosses to sort of come together or the 11 other bosses to come together under Oxmix. At some point, one of them says, hey, we've only seen these 3 guys from the Enterprise. Why are we listening to them? There's only 3 of them, or that's what it seems like, and there are, of course, more of us. And Krakow says, yeah, there were only 1 or 2 other people in when I went up to the ship. So you have this moment of skepticism that the numbers of people in the Federation, or the Feds, that there even are very many of them, or an important number of them. And at some point, Kirk says, trust me, there are 400 people on my ship. And one of them says, well, that's your story. So you say, why should we believe you? But I also think if you take those words literally, it kind of loops back to the first topic we discussed, which is characters in the wrong fiction. The numbers of people on the Enterprise, that's Kirk's story. That's Kirk's fiction. Frankly, as viewers, we've never seen 400 people on the Enterprise.
No.
We take Kirk's word for it.
Exactly.
As viewers, we're kind of asking the same question sometimes, which is, where is everybody? So these gangsters don't because they're not seeing it, they're not experiencing the details of this sort of other fiction or other universe, they have no real reason to believe them at face value.
Of course, they do have a point that there were only a handful of guys that they saw, and they would have to take Kirk's word for it. But the show of force near the end, I believe, is enough to turn the tide. So even if there weren't actually 400 people, the ship is powerful enough to take out your entire gang. So I guess the jig is up, and they have to abandon that line of thinking.
I mean, it kind of adds a bit of depth to a whole bunch of characters who previously had seemed very two-dimensional. They're just these kind of wise guys, kind of goofy, stereotypical, exaggerated, fake gangster guys. Just like Kirk and Spock and McCoy, we are not intimidated by them, even when they're running around armed to the teeth. We just cannot take them seriously as a threat. But you kind of see that in that one statement that they are thinking there is something going on behind the eyes that we hadn't previously necessarily seen or given them credit for, which is, they're not pushovers. They need proof before they're going to act on something. Just like we would, our Star Trek heroes need proof, and we as viewers need proof that it's all layers. It's a layer upon layer of, the audience member and these characters, the Star Trek characters, have become sort of audience members in this weird gangster world. And
I like the fact that even though this leans heavily in the comedy direction, they didn't make the mobsters completely bumbling fools. They actually made them intelligent and calculating and sometimes cunning villains.
All of the comedy is at the expense of the Star Trek characters, even the Fizbin.
Fizbin scene, yes.
Which is like classic. I ran it back and watched it twice because it's so good. Even the Fizbin, I think the comedy there is really at the expense of Kirk and especially Spock's, I have never calculated those odds. And when Kirk says, of course you haven't, there's that quick cut back to Spock kind of mouthing something, and you don't know what he said. It's brilliant. The gangster guy that is trying to learn Fizbin is the straight man, but he's not the butt of the joke. I mean, really, the joke is the circumstance, the fact that Kirk and Spock and McCoy, these otherwise serious, heroic characters, are reduced to this farce. All the humor is at the expense of the usually serious or heroic characters. If the gangsters had been bumbling, I guarantee you I would not like the episode the way that I do. I just can't handle bumbling stuff. Ugh.
Yeah, I think they did a good job of at least making them convincing. It's not like you're watching an episode of the 60s Batman, where the henchmen are bumbling idiots. Yeah.
Well, and I almost think villain is sort of the wrong word. I mean, they are businessmen. They have motives that, put our heroes in danger, but they're not, I don't know. I really feel like they are just totally sort of true to the gangster character, which is, you can do something that is of benefit to me, and until you do it, I'm not going to let you go. It doesn't seem like they really have any interest in killing Kirk or Spock or McCoy, because they know that if they did that, they'd be even less likely to get what they want.
Exactly.
Right?
Well, that brings up an interesting point, though. What exactly is evil on that planet? Because it's only a one-sided society. There are no good guys versus bad guys. There's only one system. There's only, it's the mob life or no life.
I was thinking about that earlier today, and I was trying to think if there were any that I've heard of, if there are any sort of historical analogs for a society that operates that way, that doesn't have any law enforcement, but that is not an anarchy. It's a very structured society, and everyone seems to fit in, know their place in the structure. It's also, though, a society built completely on retaliatory drive-by shootings. Yes. And actually, it is a really good analog for the early medieval Norse and Anglo-Saxon cultures. So basically pre-Christian Scandinavia and pre-Christian England, especially Iceland. Basically, it's exactly the culture they had. There was no law enforcement in any sort of government body or external body sense that we would have today. It was basically, if you killed your neighbor, or whoever, if you killed somebody and it was not an accident, then you either would pay their family the value of that person, and everybody had a value based on, the size of their farm and who they were, if they were important, if they were the head of a household, if they were a man, a woman, their age. It's very complicated. It's called their were guild. And you either could pay that amount to their spouse or their closest family members, or you could choose not to pay it with the understanding that the family was perfectly allowed to kill you in return. And it was like, so it could spiral out into blood feuds that lasted generations, and that was not a good thing. But usually it worked because people knew it was in their best interest, A, to not kill people because it could get out of control, and B, if you did kill somebody, you really should just pay the money, because otherwise you were opening your own family up to retaliatory violence, and it would just keep going back and forth.
Interesting.
Yeah, so like all of the Icelandic sagas are about basically these honor killings and retaliatory killings just spiraling out of control. But it worked, and the only reason that they really stopped doing that is because of the influence of the early Christian church, of course, did not think it was okay to run around killing your neighbor because your neighbor killed your brother or something. The church had a real problem with it. But prior to that interruption, socially, it actually worked quite well for them. It helped that the communities were pretty small because of the harsh conditions of Scandinavia and Iceland. But so oddly enough, it could actually work to live in a society that it's self-regulating while simultaneously violent.
Yeah, no, that actually seems to fit this episode very, very well, and you see it played out several times. So it's Krakow hits Oxmix, and he fully expects to get hit in return in an equal or even a greater number, and no one questions it. It's perfectly fine. That's the way that they live. And
the openness of the killings, the drive-by shootings in the show, it also, and the same thing is true of these early Norse societies, you had to do your revenge killing publicly so that everybody knew. It was like a regulating mechanism. Killing somebody secretly was the biggest no-no that you could do, because if it's a secret killing, the other guy's family cannot retaliate because they don't know who killed him. It breaks the mechanism. So by being really loud and open about it, you'd basically walk out your front door and announce to everybody, I'm going to go kill so-and-so now because he killed my brother, and sort of like emailing invitations to everybody so that they could come watch and know, so that everybody knew, okay, that debt has been paid. And so we can all stop thinking about it now, which fits these, driving down the street gangster hits in the episode A Piece of the Action. So, and it makes a lot more sense maybe to us now that, if they were more tactical about it and they actually went in and tried to kill Oxmix, that makes more sense to us versus just sort of indiscriminately shooting people in front of Oxmix's headquarters. But it doesn't fit the self-regulating mechanism. Well, I mean, I don't know that they were trying. I'm sure that the writers were not like, let's do an, early medieval Nordic thing. I'm sure they had no idea that was there, and I'm sure they were not trying to emulate that, but it fits.
No, it's a great parallel. So thank you for that. I actually learned something.
Hey, and so now I knew there was a reason I took all those Norse literature classes in college. Yes.
Well, it's paid off.
Yeah.
At least for me. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
So do you have anything on your list of points you want to bring up?
I really think this conversation hit pretty much all of them. Let's see. Yeah, I think this conversation really went lots of interesting places. This has nothing to do really with any sort of analysis, but I do see on one of my notes here that Kirk's gangster voice made me think of Donald Trump. Yeah, which not in any intelligent or analytical sense. It sounded like it to me.
I hadn't thought of that. And now I'm picturing Shatner with wild hair.
Oh,
because there are a couple episodes where that happened.
That's true. Yeah, I think it's just because Trump has been in the news lately.
Yeah, now
that's a whole nother issue.
Yes, and now we're getting topical on the Tricorder transmissions, which typically never happens. We're breaking our immersion, Claire.
We're stuck in the late 1960s usually. Yeah.
All right. Well, I have a couple more things if you...
Oh yeah, then go for it.
Okay, so something that is more related to the language and the dialect of the mobsters that kind of stuck out to me this last time I watched this episode, and I didn't pick up on this prior, in relation to the book and the slang terms that existed in the book. There were two words that were used by when Kirk escapes from Oxmix and is out in the street and gets caught by one of Krako's henchmen in the alleyway. And he ushers Kirk into the car to drive him to Krako's place for the first time. The guy says to Kirk, this can be a taxi or a hearse. Where did those two words come from? I don't, those are not Chicago mobster slang terms. Those are actual English words to refer to two different types of vehicle, especially hearse.
Yeah.
That's a very specific type of vehicle. So it made me scratch my head and wonder what is in that book. I mean, I would love to see the pages that outline how you're supposed to speak and what words you're supposed to use, because I would bet money that those two words would not be in that book.
No, and even if you go back to the sort of most culturally contaminating possible scenario, which is that the Horizon was intentionally teaching people English because they thought everybody should speak English. 100, so what would that be? The 2150s? Would taxi and hearse really be in the normal vocabulary of the people of the USS Horizon?
I highly doubt it.
Exactly.
Interesting. That was kind of a fourth wall break for me there.
Yes. Yeah. That's what I have to say. This kind of conversation is what I love about Star Trek, which is there's always more to think about. And even if it seems like nitpicking, I'm sure anybody listening knows it's not nitpicking, because they do the same thing themselves, I'm sure, to Star Trek. I just love the fact that it's a never ending wealth of conversation topics and thought-provoking things.
It is. I'm glad that you brought that up, actually. I guess that's something we should clarify a little bit while we're getting towards the end of our conversation, is that I think it may be easy to misinterpret some of the things we talk about as nitpicking, but as you said, I think people who are Trek people will know that we're doing it out of love and we're not tearing the show down. We're just exploring concepts that come to mind as you're watching these episodes. And that's one thing that really makes Star Trek as great as it is, because there's so much depth and so many conversations that you can have on so many broad topics based on every single one of these episodes. So
exactly,
I think that's kind of what's happening on this show. So I'm even more excited to move forward with this.
Me too. I mean, I think for most other fans of most other shows, 90% of what we've talked about, they would just say, well, the writers did it. That's why. Because the writer wasn't thinking. They would just dismiss it as an artifact of the fact that it's a TV show. And they're right that yes, the writers just made a choice, but the fact that we're thinking a lot harder about it and like, well, pretend like this choice is real. This world is real. What do the writers' choices imply for the history of this planet or the future of this planet, or,
Exactly.
No, I love doing that.
Well, and this episode, I think, is a really great one to delve into that type of a topic, because what you essentially have here is a science fiction community, a planet of people who are influenced by an alien book, which in their world was deposited there from another planet. But that book was based on something that was in our own reality. So, albeit very exaggerated, but it was based on happenings that happened on Earth in our lives that influenced a society in a science fiction show. I thought that was fascinating.
It is. They basically just decided to cosplay the Chicago gangsters, and it got out of hand and it became their actual world. I mean, which is something I think anybody listening to the show can relate to, at least in thought, if not in practice. Haven't we all, I mean, to harken back to your last episode of the Tricorder transmissions, at a convention, haven't we all looked around and thought, wouldn't it be cool if this is the way everything always was?
Exactly.
We all got to wear our Star Trek costumes whenever we wanted, and nobody looked at us funny. That's possibly what happened on this planet. They just really fell in love for some reason with the idea of these Chicago gangsters and their lifestyle, and they just began practicing it on a regular basis, and it became entrenched.
Now, wouldn't that be funny if after the next convention, the 50th, because they add the extra day, if that extra day is enough to kick us all over the edge and make us start dressing like Trek People 365? I mean,
the revolution will begin.
Yes, and they'll be sitting here on a podcast analyzing ourselves.
Yes, exactly.
So one final point that I'll throw out there, and this is one of those things I refer to as taking the fun out of it. This is something that I read in Mark Cushman's These Are the Voyages book. And by the way, I know you guys out there who've listened to our show many times before will have heard about these books ad nauseum, but cannot recommend these enough. I know you have them too, Claire, but in the section about a piece of the action, there's a small bit in there about the evolution of the script. And in the earliest versions of the script, the Iotian people were actually supposed to be transplants from Earth, which I think would have altered the story and also Dorothy Fontana and Bob Justman also felt that made the story a little less believable, or not believable enough to actually be a workable script, which made them insist on it being changed, which it became the Iotians were their own independent people who were influenced by a book. But what would we still be sitting here talking about this episode if they were Earth transplants?
I don't think we would be talking about it the same way that we have been for the last hour. I'm actually really glad that they're not Earth transplants. I think that would have taken a lot of the subtext away from just what makes this episode so bizarre and interesting. It would certainly have taken the whole idea of this being the kind of proto-holodeck episode feel of a completely separate fiction that has to be played out by our hero characters in order to escape it. Otherwise, it would just be a bunch of humans interacting with a bunch of other humans who happen to be... It'd be like if Kirk, Spock, and McCoy beamed down to a Renaissance fair.
Oh, yeah.
Basically. If they were a bunch of humans just enacting a piece of their own history, which... perhaps could have been an interesting episode in a different way, but it would not, I think, have been as interesting as, or at least not in the same ways as the actual episode was.
Yeah, I agree. I think it would have been one of those kind of heavier-handed episodes at that point, kind of like I think what we're going to cover Omega Glory at another point, but it may be one of those ones that became a little too difficult to handle, because if you have a society that's capable of space flight and warp capabilities and traveling far away and colonizing other planets, it doesn't seem to make any sense at all that they would adopt a society that existed hundreds of years prior to their own existence, that technologically was nowhere close. And you think that because we know that Starfleet in the time of the original series and beyond, we're much more enlightened. We've gone beyond the need for money and the need for fame, and it's a lot more humanitarian, and the motives are different. So for them to want to go back to that type of a lifestyle after living in the Star Trek lifestyle, if you will, it just doesn't seem like it would fly.
Well, and it seems like an awfully specific choice to make, in that, I'm sure there are plenty of people during, who are humans who choose to live differently than, they don't necessarily adopt all of the Federation ideals. Maybe they want to go live on Vulcan or marry a Ferengi or, whatever. There are so many other cultures that already really exist in their present that they can adopt or be a part of. I mean, there are certainly examples in the Next Generation of humans who live sort of, I'll say alternative lifestyles. What I mean is alternative to the Federation lifestyles.
Right.
Vosh, the archaeologist / plunderer that sort of shows up occasionally throughout the Next Generation as a love interest and a foil for Picard. She is, in a lot of ways, much closer to a modern human than Picard or anyone else on the Enterprise is. They certainly exist. It seems unnecessary for them to have a little colony where they choose one very specific time period to relive. I will say, though, there is an example of that in the Next Generation, and I think everyone knows that the Bringloidi, aka the Irish people, that's not a successful plot element whatsoever. So the Next Generation kind of did exactly what it sounds like the original piece of the action script was going to do, which is here's a settlement of humans who really came from Earth, who just chose to live in a specific historical time period, basically, despite the fact that they got to this other planet using space travel. It's memorable, but not in a good way.
Sounds like you're foreshadowing an upcoming episode.
That could be an interesting one. Actually, yeah, there's a lot to talk about on that one.
Yeah. So, any closing thoughts on Piece of the Action?
Well, I can't talk about a piece of the action without just saying and bringing the whole intellectual tone of the discussion way down and just saying that Leonard Nimoy looks fantastic in that suit.
I agree with you.
So,
I agree with you. The hat makes it.
Oh, it does. Absolutely. So Kirk's hat is kind of fuzzy. I didn't notice that until I somehow didn't see that until this most recent watch. I was really intrigued by his fuzziness of his hat.
Yeah, the detail comes out very well on the Blu-ray.
It does. Anyway, yeah, I feel like maybe we should not end the conversation on discussing fashion and hats, but I think I just took us there. So
well, my closing thought doesn't have to do with that, so maybe we can bring it back up a small notch. And something again that I came across in Mark Cushman's book that made me perk up a little bit, and this was something that he wrote about this episode, and I'm going to paraphrase it a little bit here because I don't want to read it verbatim, but essentially what he says in regards to the ridiculousness of the costumes and the mannerisms and the guns being toted around in the episode. It says, if you take that as a parallel to our current day society, replace the guns with smartphones, replace the suits with Ed Hardy shirts, and replace the slang with, texting and emoticons and the language that we use to communicate with each other via our smartphones and computers, which is at oftentimes kind of a bastardized version of our language, isn't it?
Yeah, some people more than others. I put semicolons in my text messages. I just want that known.
Someone's holding up the vigil for the semicolon.
Yes.
But, if you think about it in those terms, maybe the show is not as ridiculous as you might have once thought. Because, if you think about 100 years in the future, if someone is watching a movie or a television show that shows our current way of life, we may appear ridiculous to them because they've evolved so far past us.
I think that's a great point and a great way to close this episode. I couldn't agree more.
So, Claire, thank you so much. This has been an incredible recording. I'm very excited for the future of the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited about doing the next episode as well.
Yeah. So Claire is officially the co-host of this show. So this will be Claire and I will be back. I think every other Friday was what we determined. So Friday is going to be the release date for this, and look for us 2 times a month. And we're not going to be going in any particular episode order. We're just going to be kind of picking and choosing which episodes we want to talk about. So, and I think you had said that you want to stick to original series for a little while before moving on, right?
Yeah, I would like to stick with the original series just for a little while to begin with. But I think branching out to other series or being able to mention the other series casually in an episode is great.
So you can find out more about our show on the tricordertransmissions.com or on Facebook at facebook.com/the tricordertransmissions. We're on Twitter at TTT_pod, and Claire and I are both individually on Twitter. I am J_Benj, BENJ, and where can they find you, Claire?
I am Isolinear Chick, and let me make sure I spell Isolinear correctly. ISOLINEARCHICK.
All right, so we look forward to seeing you guys in a couple weeks for our next episode, and thanks as always for listening, and we'll catch you later.
Bye.